Saben lo que hizo el famoso mono liso a la orilla de una zanja. Cazó viva una naranja. ¡Qué coraje, qué valor! Aunque se olvidó el cuchillo en el dulce de membrillo, la cazó con tenedor. La naranja se pasea de la sala al comedor. No me tires con cuchillo, tírame.
Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon.
Hello.
So here we are for our last day. And today we have as the first presentation of Ricard Solé. That is a professor of the Catalan Institute for Research and Advanced Studies, working at the Universitat Pompeu Fabra in the Complex System Lab. I'm seeing here that you have a new book, Ricard. New book in Spanish.
Oh, well, new.
Yeah. I don't know. New book, Vidas Sintéticas.
Oh, well, it's 4 years old, but it's new somehow.
Okay.
It's fine. You can buy it.
Yeah. It would be nice to read it in Spanish, above all.
Spanish.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Tusquets
Okay.
editor. It's a very good editorial.
Thank you. So, shall I share my screen?
Yes.
Where is this?
Down, right.
Okay. All right. Do you see it?
Yes, I can see it.
Yeah? Okay. All right. Everybody sees that?
Yes, perfect.
Yes, I can see it. Yes, nice picture.
Okay. Thank you. All right. So this is going to be somewhat controversial from the experience I have. It's an idea that I launched 5 years ago, and I've been pursuing over and over again over the last years. And it has to do with a complex systems perspective of the future biosphere and how to tackle some key issues about what's going to happen in the future with this accelerated global warming and rising human populations, et cetera, you know, all the problems there in terms of what's going to be the impact on biodiversity, and in particular, whether or not we can tackle tipping points. So it's not only about understanding the nature of tipping points and the risk that they represent, but also see if we can do something about that, right? We are all familiar with that. I don't have to make an introduction about this. I do have, I think, important to mention that we are facing several problems here that define kind of a green picture of the future. We tend to talk about the end of the century, but many things can happen long before that. Having in mind this prediction from the classical Hansen's work on what's going to happen if CO2 emissions go beyond some threshold, the possibility of runaway effects. Also something that is quite essential and often forgotten, which is the extreme events. Last year we had examples of that, very unfortunate. Extreme low temperatures in North United States, for example, and extreme high temperatures in different places in the Earth, including, for example, Australia, but it reached 50 degrees Celsius and implied the death of many animals. So that connects with the topic of extinction. A few weeks ago, along with Simon Levin, we ran a workshop hosted by the Santa Fe Institute, of course, a virtual one, unfortunately, where we discussed the problem of ecological complexity and the sixth extinction. And one of the major issues we have to manage in the future is the preservation of biodiversity. That's a topic that's been there in the scientific literature for a very long time. And preserving biodiversity, it's not disconnected with try to avoiding tipping points. And what are the strategies in terms of how to intervene? Because I think this is the big issue here. We as ecologists, we keep understanding the systems, analyzing networks, trying to figure out what can happen, et cetera, but we should start really seriously to think about potential scenarios for the next 30 years to see what has to be done. One path here is, of course, protect habitats, and there's also, this is somewhat a controversial issue, but you can make some numbers about what hotspots and what's the size of the habitats that have to be protected to preserve big chunks of biodiversity. And here you can make quite a big work in terms of the theory and predict what can be done. I put this paper by Stuart Pym and Peter Raven from a while ago in 2000, because I really like the way they calculated things, but these things have to be recalculated. So the amount of extinct species due to the loss of habitat, now having in mind the problem of fires, for example, that Leonardo was mentioning yesterday, has to be recalculated very seriously. At the other extreme, if you want, the other limit and the strategies of doing something not for biodiversity, but for the problem itself of global warming, there's the idea of geoengineering. Again, this is a highly controversial issue, has been also there in the literature with little testing, and that's, I think, is a very important point to have in mind. It's easy to criticize, it's easy to question, but we need to have a real scientific picture of this. We need to test things. Whether or not this is going to work if needed, we'll see. The strategies involve creating technology. Some of this technology doesn't exist, like they're making these huge towers in the ocean that create steam so that you have more clouds. We know the impact of aerosols. That's easy strategy, but has a lot of side effects that we do know. And the thing is that geoengineering, as defined in these scenarios, does not solve the problem. CO2 is going to be there. And so maybe other things need to be considered. And every time we think about these possibilities, and I'll tell you about our suggestion a bit later on, we have the problem of complexity, in particular the multi-scale picture. When we think in ecosystems, and it depends on where and in what kind of problems you are working, you might be more interested in the genetic level in terms of genetic content, genotype, etc. There's the level of the organism, there's the level of interactions, which you can confine yourself in the pairwise. And it's the whole ecosystem level, and plus other things you need to consider to have the right picture. And we have very little understanding of how these layers connect between each other. And I'll show you why this is especially important if you want to think in terms of engineering. There's a number of concepts from ecological complexity that are relevant. The more we know, the more clear it is that we have to have them in mind. The idea of multiple stable states, the idea that criticality in terms of percolation, for example, can be relevant, memory effects, etc., seem to be part of this rich picture. Why complexity is important here? Well, you can identify that in many cases. In this workshop, we are discussing precisely this kind of problem. I have a couple of examples to mention because maybe we are relevant for the discussion. One, for example, that you already know, it's the idea that as you lose more and more habitat, this can lead to a state where essentially you cross a threshold, we call it percolation threshold, where, to make the long story short, essentially you go from a system to something that is not a system anymore. You disconnect that in many parts. And whatever it means, whatever is the context, this has to have huge consequences. And we know that in ecology, disconnecting habitat patches has consequences, very important ones. And some forecasts about the future, like these ones in this paper by Francisca Tolbert and colleagues, suggest that that could be a scenario for large parts of the forest we know in the next decades. And a similar story can be told, very unfortunately, for coral reefs. Here it's clear that scientists have been predicting a lot of things over the last decades. And I remember reading a book that I have here at home from 30 years ago, I think, where they were saying in 2050, we'll have probably lost half of coral reefs. You make the numbers. It's that already happened a while ago. So worst case scenarios seem to be the ones that are confirmed. The good part of the story, from what I'm going to discuss with you, is that we know that our understanding of ecological complexity provides scenarios where we can think in reverting states that are undesirable, states that might imply the loss of diversity, or as cases of eutrophication, etc., where the damage done essentially by anthropogenetic effects can be reverted. There are ways of doing that, and I have the picture that this could be extended in a number of ways. And one of the case studies that I would like to discuss, you have already heard about that from Max talk in particular, is drylands, semi-arid, arid ecosystems, where we know that transitions from green to desert state are going to happen in the future, right? The question is how far is this in the future, and that's an issue here. But it's a big issue because even almost whole countries live or are sustained on top of frozen sand dunes, and if global warming keeps going, that will mean that they will become just deserts with dunes, and the potential for social unrest and some social catastrophe is there. Theory provides a powerful picture here of how to analyze, how to understand the way this can happen. One important message that I think has to be taken from models is that there's a range of different models that, with particular features, particular ways of defining rules, being stochastic or not, I think that they show very clearly from the simple rules that they use, which share basic generic properties, that things like bistability are there. It's a robust property of these systems. Okay, many unknowns here have to do with how this can be connected with other problems. But bistability, for example, is a property that we know it's there, and we have to take that into account. The other thing is irreversibility. So once you cross the tipping point, you might find yourself in a really tricky situation, because you just going back a little bit in the parameter space, like aridity or grazing, is not going to solve the problem. So if you invest a lot of energy and resources, you can actually recover desert or highly degraded drylands. I put this here as an example from something that was done in China. They have been pretty much pioneers in this. In the 60s, in this particular part of the Tengar Desert, they had this problem of the sand covering the trails for the train. And they decided to make this huge engineering effort of bringing thousands of tons of haystack and other interventions. So you see here in the low middle part, this is a strip of, I think it was half a kilometer by 9 kilometers of covering the sand. And eventually, with some other efforts that you have to bring here, they brought the system back into this state. It's an important message also for something I want to discuss later on. Theory here suggests that there have to be ways, this is completely theoretical work, of actually preventing catastrophic shifts or maybe modifying the nature of the tipping points. This is work by Miguel Ángel Muñoz, Simon Levine, and others. And here's our proposal, right? Before I proceed, I want to make clear one point is that I'm not saying that a technological fix is all we have to do. That will be it's a lie. It's completely incorrect. We have to do a lot of things, including changing the economic model, shifting into new sources of energy, etc., etc. That's not the only solution, but I do think having in mind the risks that involve catastrophic shifts and accelerating changes, we need to consider this scenario where our suggestion is why not to use synthetic biology, a field that we have been working in my lab in the last 10 years. So engineering microorganisms, I'll show you an example in particular of that, so that we modify ecosystems. It's as clear as that. So it means engineering and deploying microorganisms in a habitat that can be an endangered ecosystem, but they also can be things that, as you will see, are less relevant in terms of biodiversity. Yeah, the literature is very small because it's our proposal and people starting to pay some attention to that. But the idea essentially is that you create a synthetic organism. The reason of doing that also in terms of technology is that if you want to, for example, as a potential way of tackling warming of Earth, or on a scenario that was thought is to make literally millions of mini satellites with mirrors that deflect the light from the sun, so you actually cool down the Earth. But you have to build everything. Life has a good thing here is that you build something, it self-replicates, so eventually can spread and achieve a given scale. That will require, that's what we are pursuing, it's to test whether or not this is going to work, because it's easy to say, it's not so clear that it's going to work easily. It's to testing in the micro mesocosm experimental frameworks, and then see if this is really scalable, okay? We suggested the idea of what we call terraformation motifs. There's a class of systems where essentially we define at this small number of species population dynamics, what's going to happen if you take, and that's part of the story. You don't create something in the lab and deploy in nature. You take something that is already, and that's very crucial, in the ecological web. You modify it. A slight modification might be enough in many ways. And the goal essentially is either to make a control that allows to remove something from the system, like in the bioremediation strategies, or create a symbiotic loop that in fact creates something that is kind of an ecosystem engineer. As I was saying, the target for us, the more clear that we have been studying is drylands, right? And in particular, the interactions between soil crust, which is an amazing ecosystem in itself, and the microbiome sitting there, and vegetation cover. One of the inspirations for this, just to show you why we think that this is a good idea and that it can work, comes from several case studies in synthetic biology, addressing other kinds of environmental issues. One particular, for example, is, as an example of something that has been successful, still in progress, but quite promising, is how you repair concrete cracks, right? Concrete is a major material from the Anthropocene, and when concrete degrades and cracks appear, it's the starting point of collapse of infrastructures. So one thing that has been invented, and I think illustrates the point, is a bacterium that has been engineered to live within these cracks, right? So you actually locate the bacteria there. It's a very basic medium. It's not nice for most microorganisms. It is good for these ones. And what they do essentially is create calcium carbonate. They have been engineered to do that. Bacteria that don't do that, they have been created to do that, plus a polymer. And this creates a very strong cement. They actually virtually fill the crack. And once the crack is filled, they cannot live there anymore. It's a whole new material that has been created. And once they are outside the crack, it's a complete hostile medium, they die, right? That's why we call that this ecological, this engineering motif, we call it work and die, right? Sounds like a North Korean motto, but that's the idea, that you do something that by definition, by design, allows the system to do the function and then get rid of them. For drylands, the scenario what we consider is the following. This is still theoretical. So we've been doing a lot of mathematical modeling. This paper here, Population Dynamics of Synthetic Terraformation Motifs, tries to make a first step in defining the population dynamics, as in the standard books of population dynamics for synthetic ecosystems. And what we do here is, we suggest here is to take something from the soil crust, say a cyanobacteria. We have indirect evidence that what we're proposing is a good strategy, right? And for example, you design the following. This cyanobacteria is designed so that it will secrete a material, a polysaccharide or whatever we find out that is able to retain a little more moisture. So we want to make the system be more resilient in terms of retaining water, okay, which is kind of the stress condition here. So since I put something, a genetic construct there, if it's not useful and you lose it, it's going to go back into the wild type, okay? If it works and provides some more moisture to the plant cover, the idea is the plants will thrive a little more. This is not magic. I mean, they cannot expand in an amazing way. And that will go back into improving microbiome diversity for the soil, right? That would be the idea. The nice thing of this is that you can actually define kind of properly some levels of complexity here, from the landscape to these experiments that were driven by Fernando Maestre, who is one of our collaborators, along with Nuria Conde, who is the person that runs my synthetic well lab. And experimental setups can be defined. So you can actually, Fernando has been doing a lot of work on that over the years of using small parts of soil crust, which essentially retain everything that is relevant for the ecology of that, and experiment with that from global warming to other things, okay? And we want to use that as a target for engineering. There's a number of theoretical work we've been doing lately. This is another paper that it's about modifying soil crust in these drylands, right? Kind of being a little more close to the real thing. And see, for example, that we can actually define what we call a synthetic soil crust. So we engineer something that might not have vegetation cover, so it's going to be some kind of different phase, but it's going to be resilient. So it will preserve the soil, right? And prevent the transition from green to desert, okay? So things to have in mind that I think are really, really important. One is that one of the design principles we are suggesting is to engineer ecosystem engineers, right? Either helping ecosystem engineers to be more able to change the system or create new ones. And I wanted to emphasize, and this is just one case study, that because there are connections with the ideas we have from invasion ecology with invaders, that a new species in a system is not what we are suggesting, but what might happen in some systems. A new species that acts as ecosystem engineer might have very, very interesting and relevant effects of preserving biodiversity. This is an example from ecology of a seaweed. It's an invasive seaweed that actually protected a number of species from external stress and provided a number of conditions that were useful to actually improve biodiversity. That doesn't mean that you are in the same state. The ecosystem might change, and that's a point that I want to make clear. So at this point, I guess some of you are already thinking, no, I'm not going to say you're thinking in Jurassic Park, but of course, there's the question of whether this can have unintended consequences, right? That's the usual thing that you hear. A couple of things to say. One is that it's been interesting when I was writing this idea and I went in looking into the literature, right? What is the literature, the scientific literature relevant to answer that question, right? And the reality is that it's almost nothing. Because from the 80s, when there was a ban of anything related to genetic engineering to be deployed in nature, there was almost no experiments done. There's a funny story that I found out. There's a journal that nobody knows about. It's called Microbial Releases, I think. It's a journal that only had 2 years of life. It was about potential experiments of engineering something, some microorganism and using in experimental conditions to see what's the impact. Most of the time, ecological microbial releases fail to establish. So it's something important to have in mind. The other thing is that if you ask me what are the potential unintended consequences, I have to say this question is almost non-scientific, because unless we test, we cannot answer, right? Let me tell you a little story I always tell about, now they have this picture of Jurassic Park, that when they were preparing the movie plot, etc., Jeff Goldblum, who you know is the mathematician, the chaos mathematician, called to the Santa Fe Institute, my second house, second home, to ask Doyle Farmer, who is one of the fathers of chaos theory, how does a chaos mathematician behave, right? And if you have seen the movie, clearly no information was taken seriously. So let me go for the last part of the talk. Questions that emerge, important lessons that might have to be taken there. One thing that we have in progress now with all my students, Victor Maul, is to analyze a very important problem, which is that what happens if you don't limit yourself into models with 3 populations, for example, and you go into multi-species. And one of the interesting things is unpublished, is work in progress, but it's being really, really interesting. Under the conditions we are presenting, so taking someone who is there, making a small change, making it more fit to do some functionality, but essentially being part of the whole network that was at the beginning, we found out that actually in the vast majority of cases, the engineered strain remains in the system without not specially changing the species composition. So suggesting that under this design scenario, we might be able to allow the system to go into a new functionality and not affect biodiversity, which is something that we also want to protect. One interesting thing that has been extremely helpful to think more in detail and more clearly these potential scenarios of intervention was this paper that we published early this year, led by Miguel Verdugo, because this is this large-scale analysis of many places all over the planet to analyze what kind of phases drylands we're going to experience in the future. We kind of jumps from different conditions related to soil organization, the potential for systemic breakdown, etc. And the nice thing of this study is that it brings much more clear picture of what kind of things are we're going to need to address, even from the metabolic dynamics of microbial ecosystems, or changes in the way mycorrhizae are going to interact with plants, right? And that has brought a new generation of models that we are exploring. For that, we are still working on that. This is just a toy picture. I don't want you to take that as kind of a serious definition of strategies, but we think that because we are having a better picture of these potential changes of shifts in drylands, we might also start to think very seriously in terms of what are the windows of opportunity for intervention that could go from bioengineering to or afforestation, but also is a number of really interesting things going on in terms of biomimetics and biomaterials that could also retain water and even interact with the microbiome. This can go into many scales, and there's a number of things that we have been also exploring, particularly within one European project, of what is the scale of intervention, what could be done, right? One thing I wanted to mention also is that these kind of scenarios, we have to do the experimental work as soon as possible in terms of control experiments in mesocosms, because this is quite a serious issue. We cannot think in interventions in the future without having in mind what's going to happen. Victor De Lorenzo here in this picture has been promoting also the idea that it's possible to think in quite serious terms the idea of a circular economy and in particular circular industrial metabolism. And one of the things that we are working in one of the projects we are involved is to try to find out, still under laboratory basic science conditions, whether or not reactions that we know can happen because they are used in the industry, or just because chemists have been finding in over the last 100 years, whether they can go and be translated into biological systems so that it can help make the industrial metabolism circular. One particularly important breakthrough that happened this year is that, against the odds, a group in Israel led by Ron Milo has shown that you can actually evolve artificially in the lab E. coli, which is a heterotroph, of course, into becoming an autotroph using CO2 as carbon source. There's a lot of things still to be solved, but that was a big achievement. From our side, we hope finally, after years of fighting for funding, etc., to start a collaboration with the European Molecular Biology Lab, which is, for those who don't know, it's one of the major institutions working on molecular biology that is shifting their attention now into planetary biology. And we start to collaborate next year for not only doing modeling, but starting implementing our mesocosm experiments. I also wanted to add a couple of examples that show that we are not the only maybe crazy people suggesting that. This is a paper, very nice paper in a review in Nature, where Madeleine Van Open suggests the idea that maybe we can help saving coral reefs by actually engineering the microbiomes that are associated to them, right? And this is quite a serious and a very interesting proposal. And similarly, this idea, it's less defined in a way, but also they suggest that for kelp forest, again, an ecosystem engineer is extremely important. Whether we could think in terms of intervention scenarios using synthetic biology to actually protect them from being lost and then creating cascades that we are very worried that can happen also in the future. I'm almost finished. Let me mention also, there's a lot of things I could present because we have these 4 different terraformation motifs. I only spoke about one of them. Urban centers, and that's also we think, a major component of what has to be done for the future, because more half of the population lives already in cities, and this is a growing trend. Cities are massive bioreactors, where we could also use, for example, sewage. Nobody likes sewage, maybe the Batman, but we could use that to actually engineer microorganisms in a way that, by definition, you have an ecological firewall that protects that for going anywhere, and that we could exploit in different directions. Then again, the microbiomes are the next frontier for that. And that's my last slide. I think that in a way captures some of the controversies and relevant points to be made here. What do we want, right? Because bioengineering, the biosphere, or terraforming, as we say, implies maybe changing it in some directions. Again, with the idea in mind that we will protect the hotspots of that biodiversity. But if we want to be part of the future, we need to really think what do we want to do, and what is the best scientific strategy to actually tackle that. And as you have seen, we need a dialogue between disciplines. There's people in synthetic biology thinking in things that are similar to that. For example, for the human microbiome, there's a whole ecosystem here. We are thinking, making interventions using synthetic biology, and that can be guiding us in understanding a number of things. But they don't know much about invasion ecology, and the other way around. So we really need to actually bring people together and try to see how much can we forecast, how much can we define, and to what extent we can really intervene. And thanks for your attention. Let me see if I have to unshare now, isn't it?
Yes.
Okay. All right.
Okay. Very nice presentation. So, well, and I can say a few things because I don't know if you have the opportunity to say later. So the one thing that, main thing that I can think about is that we are dealing with complex systems, and you have something that is called surprise and emergence. So in that way, it's difficult to predict what will happen when you change it. And that's the problem with this approach. But I'm saying that I like this approach, but we have to think on that. And invasion ecology is one of the areas we have to look, because we have many examples of the problems that could happen.
Mm-hmm.
So here in Argentina, we have many exotic species like beavers in Tierra del Fuego, or also the European hare. Well, these are cause many problems. And the people sometimes introduce them trying to solve other problems, and they don't solve the problem, but they make worse. Mm-hmm. And sometimes I think that it will be very difficult to scale up from the mesocombs to the biosphere, because mesocombs is small and biosphere is huge. So the scaling issue is very important here. Okay, nothing else.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I would like to make clear is that when we think in invaders, invaders usually, they are successful, particularly if before they invade, we have degraded the habitats. When you have damaged biodiversity, it's pretty easy actually to get an invader to be successful. Like rabbits in Australia or anything you can think about. which on the other hand involve something that is a multicellular system. So to define it quite in a very abstract way, whether rabbits or snails or whatever they are, that can have a huge impact in terms of positive feedback or on a species there. So you can actually propagate. What we are suggesting is that said, also the vast majority of invaders fail. That's something that we also know. There's a fraction of invaders that remain in the system as a marginal species. There's a few of them who actually succeed. And I think that we actually know quite well why. What we are suggesting is a pretty different strategy. Not to take someone from the outside that can replace something in the system, but we also think that if what you do is contributing to something as an ecosystem engineer that makes biodiversity to be maintained, biodiversity itself is an ecological firewall for anything that you want to spread in a system. Okay, that's the idea. And I think for some systems, particularly soil crust in semi-arid ecosystems, the idea that mesocosms are not going to be extrapolable to the regional scale might not be the case. Max, you want to?
Yeah, if I can ask a question, Leonardo. Thanks. Yeah, I liked very much your talk, Ricard. It was very interesting. If you talk about dryland and about spatial patterns, then I think we are scratching only the surface of the problem as to how these spatial patterns are indicative of bistability and of threshold or something like that. I think there's a whole lot of work to be done and a whole lot of surprises to discover. Also, those power laws and those deviations from power laws, as you referred to, Ricard, are not basically one-to-one indicators for threshold. So there's also a lot of work to be done there, I think, as you know. That having said, what I would like to ask is the following. So if you think about ecosystem engineering and about microcosms and about drylands, I think we can pretty well understand the system and try to restore it in a pretty successful and safe way, I must say. But indeed, as Leonardo says, when you scale up, you very quickly come to a level of understanding or a level of not understanding, I think, that makes things a bit more complex. And you referred to a scientific approach. Well, my question would be, what scientific approach do you have in terms of global geoengineering if you have only one Earth? So how many experiments can you do?
Yeah. Well, this is the multi-scale picture here is important. If you engineer something that is going to be to come from an ecosystem that is already in a given ecological context, say a microbiome from a dryland, that by definition is going to get confined into some particular context and have probably little impact in terms of the global system, because the limitation from water, etc. You cannot do something that is going to change in a savanna. I mean, it's going to be the dryland it is, shifting probably the species composition. If you go into the large scale, I'm not sure if I know what are you pointing at. We thought about things like, and that's science fiction, all right? What if you take, I don't know, Prochlorococcus, a bacterium that you have in the open ocean, and if it was possible to improve CO2 capture, for example. First of all, there's a lot of limitations of the real engineering you can do. I mean, nature has been exploring the landscape quite efficiently. So there is not so much room for engineering, for bad or for good. I mean, changing from bioengineering doesn't mean that it's going to be easy to make an impact on the global scale.
Maybe my point is basically that if you think about global scale, we have basically only one Earth to experiment with, right? Mm-hmm. So we don't really know what we are doing. Like even the complex global models, we don't understand anymore because they are so complex. Actually, there are examples that we need models to understand our models. So we have no clue how system Earth functions, how that works. So even thinking about trying to manipulate it in a way you understand and can be directed by us is a bit. I think that's not a scientific question. It's maybe a more philosophical question, whether you can even walk that way or something like that, right? I don't know if you. There has been a study recently in Nature, I think this week, that basically calculated the anthropogenic mass on Earth is now exceeding all biomass on Earth.
Yeah.
Like you can fiddle around with a microorganism here and there and an algal here and there, and I don't know. I just can't see the picture of. I can see the picture of bioengineering and ecosystem restoration, and I can see also experimenting with that. But at a global scale, I think it's. I think that is a very difficult way to go.
Right, but let me say some comments about that.
Yes, please.
One thing is that we all agree that we are already doing everything wrong.
Sure.
I think that's pretty clear, right? So sometimes, I mean, coming from, my origins is as a naturalist. So when I was young, I mean, for me, nature was something to preserve, and never imagine I will say something like, let's bioengineer the planet, right? But the thing is that we are already messing with everything. There's a number of systems that we can actually manipulate, and I just mentioned sewage as one possibility. It's a massive thing, really. Imagine just science fiction that you could engineer a bacterium that is efficient in taking CO2 in a special conditions of the sewage with carbon sources that might be extremely limited, and that you can do something about that, right? This is science fiction. I'm not saying that this is going to happen, okay? But I do think that for environments related to landfills and plastic and all kinds of things, that we could actually engineer something that exploits that as a carbon source. We might really do something relevant. And synthetic biology is evolving quite fast. So we'll see about that. But also, let me give you a counterexample for the reasoning, right? Because we think, what's going to happen if you put a microorganism in my proposal that is there with a new gene, for example, that does something in the system? We start this conversation and this discussion. Let's take the example of what the Chinese did in that case study in the Tanger Desert, right? What they do is bring in from the outside, so essentially exotics, tons of dried grass with their microbiomes, not that one bacterium. It's a whole bunch of species. It's interesting that nobody questions that. Nobody says, what are the unintended consequences of that?
Yeah, sure, because it's a limited scale, man.
Right, but
I mean, it's not so important.
Yeah. But most of what I'm suggesting is a local, regional scale, which doesn't mean that it cannot have consequences on another scale, right? But let's face. That's why my last picture, my last slide. What do we want? Because we can keep talking about biodiversity, but what if we lose it because we don't do something that might transform it, right?
Yeah. Well, one last comment, and then I will shut up. I think what we want is to go to the core of the problem and solve the problem instead of trying to counteract all kinds of phenomena that result from a problem that we probably do not really know yet. But I think I think it's more philosophical, maybe political, maybe economic issue that is at hand here that we cannot solve in this complex systems workshop. But I will give the floor to other people. But thanks a lot for your presentation and discussion. Very nice. Thank you.
Thank you.
So Juan.
Thanks, Ricard, for inspiring talk. Could you clarify, please, what are the other motifs of terraformation and where we can go and read more about it?
Yeah, well, I should show you the diagrams, because it's every motif we analyze the population dynamics, etc. But for example, for the plastisphere, for the ocean plastic, we've been working a lot on that, showing, for example, that despite the amount of plastic that humanity drops into the ocean, not very nicely, again, we are doing everything wrong. If a microorganism could be engineered, or maybe there already, because actually when you look at plastic concentration in the oceans, it's not rising exponentially. It's kind of almost stationary, and that's consistent if some microorganism is using it in some way. That's one scenario. Plastic will be the carbon source of an organism that could do several things, right? From removing the plastic to other scenarios that I never thought about them, because that's one of the things that I learned in thinking in these synthetic ecosystems, is that there's a lot of new ecology there. You know that it's a plastisphere, that this ocean plastic hosts actually a rich ecology. So some people is saying, should we get rid of that? Because, you know, it's kind of a new thing that is diverse, right? And some people said we should not degrade the plastic, instead make it more stable, so it just drops to the bottom and remains there. And there might be ways of doing that. So our motifs go around designing simple principles that essentially have one component is the plastic, it's inert. One component is something that, again, ideally is being engineered from someone that is already there, a cyanobacteria or whatever is there, and that uses that as carbon plastic for metabolizing, or maybe for doing something like making the plastic stick together, right? Making big islands that are more easy to manage. For the sewage, there are different scenarios for doing that, but again, essentially they are directed into using something that is there, that could be something that we produce that is also undesirable, but this synthetic system could actually exploit it. Nobody else will, but it could use it. And that would be coupled with other things. For example, CO2 capturing. That 2 years ago maybe was kind of a dream, and now that we see that we might engineer that, that's one possibility. We'll have a carbon sink in our sewage, which could be a really, really good thing. And if you look at our paper, there's a description of the different motifs, and we did, as I was saying, kind of the first step in population dynamics of settling down the small species population dynamics.
Okay. Any other comments?
If not, can I tell a story that I think that is it's also interesting. When I knew, yes. I was quite fascinated and inspired a lot of ideas. Maybe some of you know the Ascension Island, La Isla de Ascensión. When Darwin went into his tour around the world, you know that he was an extraordinary naturalist. He made these beautiful descriptions of everything he found here and there. When he went to Ascensión, which is really in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of the ocean, Atlantic Ocean, it's a small island, there was this group of military from the British. I think that the Portuguese had brought maybe 50 years before ship, the usual thing we do everywhere we go that creates real destruction. So the island was pretty poor. And essentially, Darwin in his diary said something like, this is a piece of dust or something like that, right? Because there's nothing here. So he went back to England and talked with Hooke. At the time, he was running how's the name of these gardens in London? The Kew Gardens, right? With this huge variety of species. And he said, why don't we do the following? We need water there for the military. So why don't we just bring plants and trees that if they stay there, they might help, retaining water in the system. So they brought essentially kind of 100 or maybe 200 species. So completely exotic experiment, kind of a synthetic terraformation. And what happened there is that a whole new ecology was established. The mountain that Darwin saw, that was gray mountain with no interest for anyone, It's a national park. It's Green Mountain. It's a beautiful place. I haven't been there. I didn't see the pictures. It's too far. But if you go there and measure anything from carbon or nitrogen in the soil, etc., and the community structure, if you're an ecologist, you will say this is a mature ecosystem, a healthy ecosystem, a rich, diverse, completely exotic, absolutely exotic. So that's one of kind of the first experiments in doing a terraformation experiment, right? And see the outcome of that. I'm mentioning that also because if we do change something, it doesn't mean that it goes into a nightmare. It goes into maybe another kind of community distribution, right? But the potential for biodiverse, really diverse ecosystem into building stable states is huge. So something else that we have to have in mind.
Yeah, well, I thought about, for example, we have Patagonia here. That is a huge extension of Earth that is almost semi-arid, with that it could be covered by trees, for example. But
there's a problem with that of course trees will be fine provided that, but trees are macroscopic structures. They need water, and they can.
Well, there are trees that can survive there, and there were some experiments from.
I heard about that. Yeah.
With some tree, that the communities, for example, were very healthy. But the trees were exotic. But there are a lot of people that is against that.
Yeah.
So well, these were experiments because in some years they give some kind of money to do some plantations, and then they forget about that, and they were still there in regions that with many with few precipitation, but they are developed. They don't expand, but they are there. So
yeah, that happened in a number of places. Yeah.
I think that there is we can do that kind of things to make the planet better, but well, it's difficult.
Yeah, there's plenty of stuff to do.
Yeah.
Can I ask you something, Ricard?
Yeah, sure.
Did you hear about this initiative, the Green Wall?
Yes.
And, what is your idea about that, please?
I have mixed feelings. I think that there are not only this example, there are examples all around the world of interventions, even by single people that decided to do things, and some of them have been very promising. I don't know if the large-scale intervention like that is going to be successful. We need time. That's one of the problems also. You see the experiments that I just talked about, this desert engineering. It took a while because to rebuild a stable system that is more resilient, you need at least some decades, at least at the scale we know. So I don't know.
Yeah, well, what I think about this green wall, I don't know if people know what the green wall is. It's like the idea of planting a whole lot of trees south of the Sahara and north of the Sahel to prevent the desert moving in. Well, to me, it's a complete misconception of how things work. So it's a guarantee to failure for me. But that's my maybe not so nuanced opinion about that. And maybe the idea is being executed a bit more nuanced like that, and not really lots of bad things can happen from it. But the idea of stopping the desert with by a green wall is even, I mean, it's more simplified than a cartoon, I think.
Yeah, I'm afraid so.
Yeah, but okay, thanks.
So very nice. Well, we need 5 minutes to break for the next talk, and I thank you very much, Ricard, for your invigorating. I don't know the words to say.
Yeah, and please, every one of you, if you have any feedback that you want to send me, I'll really appreciate it, because sometimes from these workshops, people comes from a comment that is really enlightening. So I appreciate that.
Fine. So many thanks. Well, we need 5 minutes, so we will start the next talk by Ben on Lamberty in 10:05.
Okay.
Okay. And then I will do this small interval.
All right. See you later.
See you.
Me dijeron que en el